What are your thoughts on this? Filibuster, no filibuster? Where should we go?
This has been the question since day one of the Biden administration. Will he get rid of the filibuster, or will he let his entire agenda be set by Joe Manchin? And when I say let, I don't mean to imply that it's a passive choice by Joe Biden. He is making a choice every day that he doesn't get rid of something that he has described as a Jim Crow relic to have a Joe Manchin presidency. And the idea that there's some tension there, that it's oppositional, that, Joe Biden would like it to be better and like things to be different, but what can he do? His hands are tied, is a fiction that has been very carefully constructed to absolve Joe Biden and the other corporate Democrats from any responsibility here. As reporting indicated that came out a few weeks ago, it's not just Joe Manchin, it's not just Kyrsten Sinema. There are as many as 10 congressional Democrats who are there waiting in the wings, willing to share responsibility for tanking a progressive agenda. If one of the two faces of this effort were to, for some reason, flip, right? So the question is, why is there such an overwhelming amount of corporate influence in the party that is willing to share the blame, as it were, so that we can't get the kinds of things that people of both parties actually want? And so the filibuster conversation, we're going to see it bandied around until it's no longer an issue because we lose power in the midterms.
Yeah, this is a great question, and there's actually a number of stories written that I'm sure you've seen that talk about how much money these corporations have given, even to the legislatures that help pass a lot of these restrictive voting reforms. But talking about the three-person presidency, Joe Biden, Joe Manchin, and Kyrsten Sinema, let's take a look at how CNN digested Sinema's recent op-ed claiming the filibuster actually works for democracy.
For Senator Sinema to say that the filibuster historically has encouraged bipartisan cooperation, really, it's the opposite. I mean, Republicans now have no incentive to negotiate on what they might or might not accept on federal voting rights because they know that the Democrats can't pass anything under current rules. If there was no filibuster, if the Republicans knew that something could be passed over their objections, there would be more incentive for something like the Manchin compromise to be taken seriously on the Republican side.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. Obviously, it's hard to take seriously the idea that the filibuster has enhanced democracy. I think I would give a little bit more legitimacy to the argument that it's purely tactical, or some people are thinking of it in tactical lines. Congress flips so constantly. We become so used to these narrow majorities and flipping. You have to be a little concerned that, if you seize the ring of power, your enemy is going to have it next. I was kind of interested in a proposal by Ross Douthat to change the filibuster margin to 55, split the baby a little bit, whereas you could have some room for coalitions, and it's not as extreme as either option. What do you think about that, Briahna?
On that same podcast episode, they interviewed Bernie Sanders, and when he was asked about this, his response was, look, the way to get past this is to have supermajorities in Congress. That at the end of the day, his remarks suggested that he understood that inching up the margin or inching it down a little bit wasn't going to really have the effect that people hope it would, because it isn't just Kyrsten Sinema and Joe Manchin. There's a whole phalanx of people ready to be the face of obstruction if necessary. And that what you really need to have is ideologically aligned senators in larger volumes to actually push through legislation. It would take someone more naive than children in a sandbox not to understand how leverage works on the most basic level in Congress. And at a certain point, it becomes really frustrating 5 months into this administration to still be having these conversations and playing these games around questions that were obvious to most of us on the left who were genuinely invested in getting real things passed in the middle of a global pandemic and economic crisis on day one.
By the way, I caught one egregious lie where Cenk just said that he didn't advocate bombing Syria. There's a clip from the Young Turks in 2013 that's been circulating where he does advocate bombing Syria. So Cenk is lying because Cenk is a liar, as we saw when Cenk declared on his show that I'm paid by the Russians without any evidence, because there is none. He's just making it up. And look, I think when Cenk talks about Jimmy's audience being right wing, he's projecting. Jimmy's success over these last few years has come from the fact that he's speaking to an audience that is upset by the Democratic Party because they haven't been left-wing enough. Jimmy's actually an authentic progressive, and he's attracted people who are upset by the fact that the Democratic Party establishment has abandoned it, and attracted people who are upset that outlets like the Young Turks that portray themselves as being progressive have abandoned progressive values and have done things like advocating for foreign interventions, and in the case of Russiagate, buying into the dumbest conspiracy theory of all time, which Jimmy Dore debunked. So I think that's what helps explains this animus and these lies towards Jimmy Dore by Cenk. And then I got involved when they directed it at me. I was in Syria recently doing some reporting, and they had Cenk and Anna Kasparian had this on-air meltdown where they said I'm paid by the Russians, that I deny the killing of children. Anna Kasparian said that I likely work for dictators, and she gave me the finger and told me to F off. It was insane. And I think that meltdown reflects just like a general hostility that they have towards people who are upholding actual progressive values and upholding actual journalism standards.
Well, thanks for giving us your side, Aaron. While we have you here, we wanted to get your thoughts on recent U.S. foreign policy developments with the Ukraine.
Okay, but look, let me first address the Syria part of this because it's important. So the reason why they slandered me at that time is because I was in Syria. And Syria is a touchy subject for many people on the left. It has been divisive. But the facts to me are pretty overwhelming. And there's only a very small group of journalists that have been willing to acknowledge them. My colleagues and I at the Gray Zone are among them. So are Jimmy Dore, by the way. Jimmy Dore has been telling the truth about the fact that the U.S. and its allies have waged a multi-billion-dollar dirty war that left Syria in ruins. And I saw it firsthand when I was there. And a part of that reporting that I've done has been on this scandal at the OPCW, the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, where you have evidence of a very significant cover-up. So basically, in April 2018, the U.S., Britain, and France bombed Syria after they accused Syria of committing a chemical attack in the town of Douma. And there was video footage from Douma put out by militants who controlled it at the time of dead bodies. And they said that they were killed by a chemical attack. So Trump led the way in bombing Syria. A year later, the OPCW came out with a report basically aligning with the U.S. narrative that Syria was guilty of a chlorine attack. But then we got an extraordinary series of leaks that showed that actually the inspectors from the OPCW who went to Douma, they wrote up a report, and that report said there was no evidence of a chemical attack. And if you read the report closely, you actually see indications that they found evidence that this thing was staged. But instead of having their findings released to the public, people above them censored their report, tried to doctor the conclusions to falsely suggest Syrian government guilt. And basically, these inspectors, after they protested the censorship, they were taken off of the case. And we know this now because of a huge trove of documents that have come out via WikiLeaks and also at the Gray Zone. So I've been reporting on this for the last 2 years. It's an extraordinary story. It's a major pro-war deception, and it's allegations of a cover-up at the world's top chemical weapons watchdog, basically in the interest of the U.S. So I've been pretty much alone in the U.S. media in covering it. And so the Young Turks, instead of covering this story, have ignored it. And then when I went to Syria and I put out a short video talking about it, that helped trigger this meltdown. So what they've done in doing this is actually helping to bring attention to the story, which the rest of media have ignored, which I'm grateful for. But it also shows how progressive media outlets have been completely co-opted into going along with the talking points and narratives of the establishment, to the point that they're willing to slander independent journalists who are covering such an explosive story, such as a cover-up at the world's top chemical weapons watchdogs.
Is going to get into the race, but right now it's Fetterman's to lose. And for Connor Lamb to make a real run at Fetterman, he would have to pick up basically all of the support that Arkush is getting now. So if Emily's List only endorses Arkush and that's the end of it, then Connor Lamb still has a pretty solid path. But if they end up spending a couple $1 million like they did in 2016 to elect Katie McGinty, a lot of that is going to come out of Connor Lamb's hide and make it much more difficult for him. Because the most recent polling that Fetterman's campaign put out had Fetterman in the 40s and Lamb down in the 20s. So it's not like Lamb is walking into this like Joe Biden, not having to do anything but just waltz to the nomination.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And, Fetterman has also had the benefit of having sparred with Donald Trump and a lot of the Republicans over, some of the recount and or, myths about there being election tampering. I think you bring up an important point. I think there's basically zero chance that Emily's List is going to endorse in a statewide race where Val is the only woman in the race and then not actually throw down for her, right? Like, this is what Emily's List does. They come in and they help you raise the money, and then they put their own resources in the forms of IEs behind you. I think, Connor Lamb is looking at some trouble, considering that he hasn't had the same kind of name ID or recognition that Fetterman has, and now Emily's List is about to throw down heavy for Val Arkush.
Right, and Connor Lamb, his entire argument really is electability, because his voting record and his basic stances are not in step with kind of the mainstream of where the Democratic Party is now. But the Democratic Party primary electorate has historically been willing to put their own interests aside to go ahead and nominate somebody that they believe is going to be more acceptable to all these weird people that they don't understand in the middle of Pennsylvania. And so that's kind of Connor Lamb's shtick. Like, he can say, look, I'm the one that can appeal to all of these people. But Lamb has a huge problem in this race. And by huge, I mean about 6'10". And it's this John Fetterman, who has this biker mystique, who just screams to these Democratic primary voters, I'm the guy who can win all of these people that look like me in central Pennsylvania. And, even though I align with your politics and not theirs, because he's plain spoken, and he has shown in his statewide races that he can actually deliver. A lot of the times when these centrist or conservative politicians say that they're electable because they're going to be able to win these voters in the center and on the center right, they don't actually win them, because they don't, Democratic primary voters understandably don't actually understand Republican voters. They're different worlds. But Fetterman in the past, particularly in his lieutenant governor race, did actually cut into those margins in central Pennsylvania. And so if you're a Democratic primary voter at that point, you're like, well, wait a minute, I could vote for the guy who has shown that he can win these conservative voters without compromising the kind of populist progressive ideas that Democratic primary voters like. Or we can go with Connor Lamb, who may or may not be able to carry those voters, and actually, I believe, underperformed Joe Biden in 2020.